Corruption in governments occurs when politicians or public officials engage in fraudulent activities to benefit themselves and those close to them. And in this video, I'm going to make a case for why, believe it or not, corruption can actually be a good thing. Sometimes. Now, the aim here isn't to encourage officials to commit more corruption. Rather, it's to help you view the world through a different lens. This lens might not be suitable for every scenario, but it's a valuable perspective to add to your toolkit for understanding the complexities of the world. So, let me introduce to you the Corruption is Good puzzle. There are 4 crucial pieces missing from this picture, and in this video I'll introduce them one by one. By the end, the idea that corruption can be good sometimes will seem logical, even inevitable. And it all begins with airplanes. Nobel Prize-winning economist George Stigler once said, "If you never missed a plane, you're spending too much time in airports." And the reason he said that has to do with the first piece of the puzzle, a metric called utils. In economics, utils are a made-up unit of measurement used to quantify the utility, gain, or loss from an activity. Since utility is subjective, the amount of utils assigned to the same activity can vary from person to person. For instance, eating an apple might give you 2 utils while it only gives me 1. The actual number doesn't really matter. What matters is the relationship between them. Whether we say 2 utils or 10,000, what's important is that you get twice as much utility from the apple as I do. So, after booking a flight, there's one crucial decision to make. How early should you arrive at the airport? Everyone knows that showing up just 5 minutes before your flight is a bad idea, but should you arrive 1 hour early, or 2 or 3 or even 4 hours in advance? To keep things simple, let's focus just on 2 options. Option number 1, arrive 3 hours early and guarantee you never miss your flight. Or option number 2, arrive 1 hour early with a 10% chance of missing your flight. Now, let's say that for you, each hour of time is worth 1 util, and missing a flight is worth minus 10 utils. If you only fly once a year, it doesn't really make much sense to risk missing your flight. In this case, the expected utility from arriving 3 hours early would be a net loss of 3 utils. 3 hours of time loss. On the other hand, arriving 1 hour early would result in an expected net loss of 2 utils, minus 1 util for the hour spent waiting, plus a 10% chance of losing minus 10 utils if you miss your flight. Although the math suggests arriving 1 hour early is better, the peace of mind from knowing you won't miss your only flight of the year is probably worth more than that 1 util difference. But if you fly 40 times a year, the math changes. Arriving 3 hours early would add up to a total loss of 120 utils, whereas arriving 1 hour early would only cost you 80 utils in total. In this case, no amount of peace of mind could make up the difference of 40 utils between the 2 options. Therefore, you could argue that occasionally missing your flight is actually a good thing, and it's better than never missing a flight. You might see where I'm going with this. If you don't worry, it will all make sense at the end. Anyway, have you ever committed tax fraud?
I'm crazy enough to take on Batman, but the IRS? No, thank you.
Here's the second piece of the puzzle. The second piece is this premise. There will always be people who try to exploit or cheat a system. Here, a system refers to a set of things working together as parts of a mechanism or an interconnected network. Whether it's the banking system, the railroad system, or the tax system, there will always be individuals who look for ways to cheat it. This premise is grounded in how I view human nature and the history of systems. For as long as systems have existed, people have tried to manipulate them. Take irrigation, the first system ever created by humans. The earliest evidence of irrigation dates back to about 6000 BC in the Middle East Jordan Valley. And right around that time, that's probably where people started trying to take advantage of that new system. One notable example of this dates back to around 2500 BC in what is now southern Iraq during the Umma-Lagash War. Umma and Lagash were neighboring territories, and at one point the king of Lagash diverted water to deprive Umma of this life liquid. These kinds of power plays and attempts to exploit systems for personal gain have occurred throughout history and continue today. If we accept this premise that there will always be individuals who try to cheat systems, we can reasonably expect that some will always try to exploit the tax system, often illegally. In other words, tax fraud will always exist. Stating this premise is important because it provides context for the role of agencies like the IRS, Internal Revenue Service, or the CRA, Canada Revenue Agency. The problem of tax fraud isn't something that can be solved with a one-time investment. You can't just fund a tax agency once and expect tax fraud to disappear forever. The more money you spend on that agency, the more the tax fraud they're going to be able to uncover. And the less money you spend on that agency, the more people will feel safe committing tax fraud. So, how do you solve the problem of tax fraud? There are two main options. The first one is to completely abolish the tax system, a dream for some anarcho capitalists, but not a practical choice for most. The second option is to hire more staff and invest in better auditing technologies. This is the more valuable approach. But how much should you invest, and can that investment actually eliminate tax fraud? To know the answer to that, we need to add in the third piece of the puzzle, diminishing returns. Diminishing returns is when adding more of something gives you less and less extra benefit. Take the IRS as an example. Every year, the IRS calculates something called the voluntary compliance rate, which is the total amount of taxes they collect divided by the total amount they estimate they should collect. In the 2020-2021 tax gap analysis, that rate was about 84.9%, meaning 84.9% of taxpayers in the United States complied voluntarily. This left the IRS with a tax gap of $688 billion in 2021, which included honest filing mistakes, unfiled taxes, and outright fraud. The most effective way to reduce this tax gap is to invest more in the agency, enabling more audits, investigations, and reminders for those who forgot to pay. In 2021, the Congressional Budget Office estimated that each dollar invested in the IRS would yield a $2.50 return. This ROI, return on investment, is not the same type of return that you get from the stock market. If you invest, for example, in any index fund, the amount you invest will not change your return. For agencies like the IRS, however, the ROI was calculated based on an $80 billion investment over 10 years, expected to generate $200 billion in revenue. This return won't stay at $2.50 forever due to diminishing returns. There's a limit to how much can be recovered, with the literal maximum estimated at $688 billion. For the IRS, as the pool of missing tax dollars shrinks, the harder it becomes to collect them. At first, when the agency is understaffed, the ROI is high because there are many obvious cases of tax fraud that go unaddressed. But over time, as more agents are hired and the easier cases are resolved, each additional agent will have to work harder to catch the next instance of fraud. It's like finding a parking spot at Disney World. When the parking lot is mostly empty, finding a spot takes no time at all. But as it fills up, because the parking lot is huge, finding a spot might take 30 minutes or even more. Eventually, you could spend more time looking for a spot than enjoying the park. If every spaces are filled but one, you should probably go to Universal Studio. For the IRS, if investment continues, eventually the ROI will drop to $1, meaning a dollar spent returns exactly $1. At that point, investing more becomes unprofitable. You'd be spending more to prevent tax fraud than the fraud itself cost the government. In fact, the magic number is probably above $1 when you factor in opportunity costs and interest on any additional debt. This means that if an agency like the IRS claims to have closed the tax gap completely, it's either lying, has made a major technological breakthrough, or is spending more on audits than it's recovering in taxes. In other words, a country with a little bit of fraud is actually better off than one with none at all, unless, of course, the country has no tax laws to begin with. To reach a conclusion that corruption can be good, we need to add the final piece to our puzzle, the second premise. Bureaucracy, or red tape, slows down governments. This idea is pretty self-evident, I think. For example, if you want to incorporate a business, the more paperwork you have to complete and the more approvals required, the longer the process will take. So, let me restate our two premises. First, there will always be people who try to exploit and cheat systems. And second, bureaucracy slows down governments. Now that we all agree on those two premises, there are two main ways to deal with corruption. You can either hire more employees to do audits, investigations, and reports, or you can increase the amounts of checks and balances for money spent, deals made, and people hired. For the first option, eventually, just like with the IRS, there comes a point where the return on investment will drop below $1 for every dollar spent on this anti-corruption effort. Plus, there's this question of oversight. Who will ensure that the anti-corruption team itself isn't corrupt? And who will monitor those overseers? The other option is to add more bureaucracy. Bureaucracy itself is not bad per se. A little bit of it can be a very good thing. But the more you add, the slower government gets until you reach a point where such a government would likely be so bogged down in red tape that it would accomplish almost nothing. This reminds me of the $10,000 bus shade in Los Angeles known as LaSombrita, which sparked outrage last year. In May 18, 2023, the X account KDI posted this. The official LaSombrita, our shade and lighting palette for the LADOT official Gender Equity Action Plan, was unveiled this morning. And let's just say the reaction to this post wasn't really kind. It's truly a golden age for grifters. I don't mean to be rude, but this is really effing stupid. You women in public service always make incredibly bad decisions. To be fair, it does look pretty bad and ineffective, but it highlights how bureaucracy can slow down governments in unexpected ways. First, let's dismantle the misinformation about this bus shade. It wasn't funded by public taxes, and it wasn't the result of endless bureaucratic back and forth. In fact, it was actually a way to jump over the red tape and avoid it all because getting anything approved in LA is really complicated. For example, to build a bus shelter in LA, you need to go through a 16-step process involving 8 city departments and an elected official sign-off for each step. This can take months and sometimes years, which is why the designers aim for a quick solution while larger projects remain in the sluggish approval process. They even considered adding a sunshade blade that could rotate to shield you from the sun, but it would have violated the Americans with Disabilities Act. Ultimately, they settled on this design, easy to install without extra infrastructure, but not very effective. So although the design wasn't the direct work of bureaucrats, it was a clear symptom of too much red tape. This brings us back to the idea of adding more bureaucracy to prevent corruption. The more regulations, checks, and balances you introduce, the slower the process becomes. While slowing down can be beneficial in some cases, eventually it stifles creativity and makes it difficult for people to get anything done. So you have a choice. Either loosen the regulations a bit and tolerate some backroom deals and embezzlement, or end up with something like the ineffective bus shade. Now, let me give you an example of a good check and balance. In Canada, the C.D. Howe Institute published a report in 2022 evaluating the fiscal transparency of the federal and provincial governments. This report card on the usefulness of governments' budgets, estimates, and financial statements assigns letter grades that reflect how readily an interested but non-expert user can find, understand, and act on the information they should contain. And as you can see by looking at Table 2, the federal government had decent grades in 2019 and 2020, but during COVID, it all went downhill. Among the provinces, Manitoba ranked the lowest for fiscal reporting, while Alberta ranked the highest. Although producing this report is likely expensive, it helps keep Canadian governments more accountable than they would be without it. This ties back to the concept of utils. Ultimately, it's all about weighing the positive and negative utils gained from an action. Let's say preventing 80% of corruption brings in plus 1,000 utils, while the cost of doing so is minus 500 utils, resulting in a net gain of 500 utils. In this case, it's clearly worthwhile to prevent 80% of corruption. But now let's calculate the utility gained by eliminating the last 20%. The benefit might still be 1,000 utils, but the cost could rise to minus 5,000 utils. Here, it's better to accept some corruption than to pursue complete eradication. However, it's important to account for as many variables as possible, as it's not just about costs and profits. Let's say you want to prevent a quarter of that remaining 20%. The gain might be plus 500 utils, but the cost could be minus 600 utils, making it seem unworthy. But what if we add another variable? Trust in institutions. By reducing corruption, there may be fewer scandals, which could boost public trust in the government, adding an extra 200 utils to the equation. With this variable considered, the total outcome becomes positive. This means that efforts to combat corruption don't always have to be economically efficient, but they do need to be efficient in some meaningful way. Eventually, you'll reach a point where trying to prevent the last 5, 10, 15% of corruption just isn't worth it, whether institutionally, economically, or psychologically. In this video, I've covered a range of topics: planes, utils, human nature, tax fraud, diminishing returns, opportunity cost, bureaucracy, and corruption. The aim here wasn't to justify corruption or tax fraud, but to offer a different perspective on those complex issues. Of course, the goal should always be to reduce corruption as much as possible. If there were a button that could eliminate corruption without any side effects, I would press it. However, when solving problems, we need to think beyond less is always better. Reducing something to zero isn't always the best approach, as every action has consequences. This kind of thinking applies to many other areas. Take police brutality, for example. There will always be some officers who abuse their power. So, how can we address this? Well, if money were no object, we could equip each officer with 2 body cameras, live streaming their footage on YouTube for public transparency. This would likely reduce police misconduct by 99%, as no one would want to abuse their authority while being watched live. But is this solution realistic? It would probably be extremely costly to implement first, and it could also hinder law enforcement, as criminals might use the live feed to evade capture. In this case, the overall utility calculation would probably result in negative utils, meaning the downsides outweigh the benefits. Maybe in the future, AIs will be able to bring the cost of these solutions down. Maybe we'll have automatic tax fraud detection, automatic government oversights, and automatic police brutality investigations. Will that solve everything? Probably not, but I'm sure it would help. These technologies, however, do not exist presently. And as long as they don't, a little bit of tax fraud will be better than no tax fraud. A little bit of police brutality will be better than no police brutality. And a little bit of corruption will be better than no corruption. Thank you for watching. Let me know what you think about this topic in the comments down below. If you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you. I'll talk to you next time.